Welcome back to WHDT World News. We're talking with former FBI agent, now whistleblower, Colleen Rowley. We're discussing surveillance in America. Now, Colleen, I want to talk about national security. Edward Snowden has recently revealed through Glenn Greenwald that the president or the NSA has been listening, tapping into the phones of world leaders. And how does this affect our placement on the world stage? Does this violate a certain trust that world leaders have amongst themselves?
Well, of course, a lot of our national security depends upon allies. And even actually in the case of Russia, Russia is the country that gave the United States the information about the Sarnoff brothers. And so the ability to share information with foreign countries is absolutely key to our security. In the case that I was a whistleblower about, it was the French intelligence agencies that shared information about the terrorist suspect Moussaoui and said he was connected to a Chechen leader who was in turn working for bin Laden. So, I mean, it absolutely hinges upon this. Now, if we destroy that relationship with foreign countries, we're going to be on our own. And actually, many other foreign intelligence agencies are as good, if not better, than the United States ones. There's some other dangers here that we're setting.
Will this force nations to turn their back on the ally that they have with the United States?
Well, no one knows how this is going to end, but certainly it has caused rifts in diplomacy. And I think there will be some cost to it. Germany and France, for instance, want to be allowed into the sharing club. They realize now that they were not in that top tier of Anglosphere countries that speak English. The UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand were in a more elite sharing situation than France and Germany. So that might be good in a way if they can actually join that club. But I would say that we need to actually increase the amount of sharing internationally. And then, of course, the lessons of 9/11 themselves are that secrecy, excessive secrecy, and compartmentalization, and in some cases competitiveness between agencies are what kept the so-called dots from being connected.
But what about the average person who's being swept up into these data harvesting programs? If all this information is being shared through all these interconnected global agencies, how do we preserve the privacy of the individual who says, you know what, I'm just a guy, and I don't want to be surveilled. I don't want to be harvested. I don't want to be part of this whole interconnected global surveillance system.
The very first thing to realize is this is a myth that you can collect trillions of pieces of data in the computer through operation of algorithms, or some genius program can tell the government who are the terrorists. And so get over that. It's not true. Our National Academy of Sciences studied this at Sensenbrenner and Homeland Security's a request back a few years ago, and they found there was no proof that a computer can do this. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But what happens is, by filling the systems full of non-relevant info, it's like adding hay to a haystack. And again, the terrorists that you're looking for is relatively rare. Does it help to actually add more non-relevant info into this thing, or was it better before 9/11? Actually, before 9/11. The pieces of information that the CIA had, they knew the identities of some of the hijackers. The Defense Department knew some of the identities of some of the hijackers. And the reason was they were not conducting this massive spying, and they did not have irrelevant data. They had mostly relevant data.
So let me ask this question. With all this technology, and they're able to sweep up massive amounts of information, and sift through it in computers and cross-analyze it. Has this made intelligence agencies lazier, because now they don't have to have boots on the ground getting real organic data, and then what I'm trying to go at here is, because the American people are individuals and they don't want their information to be harvested, going back to the older way of spying, the cloak and dagger and the shadows types of spy agent, looking and surveilling with their own eyes, writing down the information, sending it up the food chain because they have a confirmed line of sight with their target. That's the old school way of doing it, in like Hollywood movies. So has this technology made them lazier, and are those boots on the ground individuals still in effect?
I think the agents, there are quotes by agents and people on the inside saying this is creating noise and what they call Pizza Hut leads. So you spin your tires on all these false leads because that's the problem with the computer and the collection of non-relevant data. It has a number of false positives. And so after you've chased down your umpteenth Pizza Hut lead, you kind of shake your head and say, what are we doing here? This is ridiculous. Even during the COINTELPRO period, when they were collecting information on civil rights leaders and anti-war groups and feminists, it amounted to about the same type of thing. I joined the FBI when retired agents had been through that, and they kind of chuckled and said that it was called post and float. And you talk about laziness. All they had to do was follow somebody, alleged to be a third cousin of a communist, and start a file up, and their career would be okay. Their performance would be gauged according to how much paper they had filed. And so you're getting into the same thing now electronically, even more so. And it is lazy. It isn't very fruitful. Again, there's no evidence.
So even though it's sort of a lazier way to collect intelligence, it's actually creating more work.
Here's the flip side of this. This laziness is not leading to anything. There's kind of a presumption that you would be doing it for a reason. Keith Alexander, the NSA director and head of the Cyber War Command, when he was asked how many times, what has this led to? How many cases of terrorism have you been able to stop in the United States? And the first time he was asked this a few months after the Snowden disclosures, he said 54. There's been 54 cases. Well, news media like yourselves immediately looked at those, at least the declassified examples. They said, no, this case is not an example of where the NSA did it. This was a case of where a foreign country told us. And in fact,
in a lot of those cases, there are agencies that place individuals inside those cells to plant dummy explosives, to give them a cell phone and say, press this button, park it outside the Federal Reserve, and then they go ahead and they pound their chest, we saved the day. I mean, how much of that is going on of those 54? From our investigation, I'd say a majority of them.
Well, that's right, because the NSA feeds their, what I said were the Pizza Hut leads, to the FBI. Then the FBI from there takes it a step forward and usually introduces the target person to an undercover informant, and some of these informants have really crossed the boundaries. They've engaged in entrapment. There's some horrible examples of cases where FBI informants were even having sex with people trying to get information out of them that way. I mean, there's been some really bad examples. The FBI official who testified in July was only able to document one example of a case of terrorism that affecting the United States, and even that case was extremely flimsy. It was a taxi cab driver in San Diego who was alleged, or he was actually convicted of giving a few $1,000s to someone he thought could be connected to the Al-Shabaab Somalians. So and of course, who knows how much proof went into that, but that's how flimsy the only example. Now, if we have every American's metadata, dozens of records for every man, woman, and child, not only in the NSA databases, but in these other 15 intelligence agencies' databases. And that is the only case after all this time they can document. I mean, think about the $1 trillion+ that has gone in, taxpayers' money that has gone into creating these computer systems. I mean, that alone should outrage Americans, not to mention the fact that they have all these records on them that are
with a government that's on the cusp of shutting down every time a budget battle comes up, and they continue to kick the can down the road. And now we see all, as you're displaying here, all this extra work that is being generated by these computer programs, all the foot traffic that has to be done to investigate all these individual leads, and all the manpower that's required to do it. It seems like there is a considerable amount of waste being generated by these spying programs.
And going back to security, the last terrible terrorist attack was the Boston Marathon. Russia had actually alerted the United States about the Sarnoff brothers. Now, the FBI in Boston was collecting data on the Occupy groups and on protesters, etc. So it actually is worse than that, because it can actually, this vast collection of non-relevant, in fact, should be illegal to collect information on protesters and Occupy. They shouldn't have, in the old days before 9/11, the FBI was not even allowed to collect that type of information. And there's been all kinds of abuses since then.
So the FBI was collecting information on Occupy, on peaceful protesters. Meanwhile, the Russian government is sending information saying, you have terrorists in your midst, get on it, and yet the attack continues.
And Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber, his own father called the State Department to alert the United States to his son, and that was ignored. The Major Hassan, who shot 13 people at a military base, he was at his conversations, there were 11 or so, 10, 11 conversations that he had with the Al-Awlaki, who they claimed later was this top American that had to be killed by drones, etc. Well, these 10 conversations were they listened to? They were in the system. So it shows you that this is the worst system going. You only want to collect relevant information. The Fourth Amendment is that under due process is that you have to have some probable cause, or at the very least reasonable suspicion. It's not necessarily, you talked about privacy, and people look at that as a luxury. They look at your privacy as a luxury. It's actually, the Fourth Amendment works, and it actually works in a very pragmatic way, because you do not want to be distracted with non-relevant cases. You actually do want to have the type of a process that will, be accurate.
So is it safe to say that if we simply followed the United States Constitution, that we wouldn't have all this waste, people's privacy would be respected, and the actual work would get accomplished?
That's what I've been saying now since 2003. I've written on this issue of civil liberties, and sometimes I feel like a voice in the wilderness, because the myth out there is that this excessive secrecy and bending and shortcutting the Constitution is what keeps us safe. You saw this on that TV show 24, that if you just torture somebody, then you can save the day. You can find the ticking time bomb. So people have been greatly misled that violating the law is somehow some shortcut way to protecting you and keeping your security. And it's just the opposite. The law itself is pragmatic. Torture doesn't even work to collect timely information. The best methods of getting information, if you wanted security, is to use rapport building. It's the opposite of torture. But the public is really, unfortunately, not being told the truth. And when that happens, you do get into a situation where a majority of Americans now think the United States has to torture in order to keep them secure.
All right, last question. We're coming up against the clock now. What can be done to slow this rise of surveillance and getting us back to the foundational structure that this nation was created on?
There has been some bills introduced a few days ago. Leahy and Sensenbrenner have introduced the USA Freedom Act to roll back some of the Patriot Act and some of the FISA Amendments Act. And so everyone should be calling Senator Leahy and Sensenbrenner. Sensenbrenner was actually the author of the Patriot Act, and so he's the co-author now of the law of the bill that would roll back some of the Patriot Act. The other very important,
let me ask you this: why the change of heart?
The other very important person, well, because he realized that this has really gone off the tracks. Sensenbrenner, to his credit, has always been cautious. And, he's a conservative, so he's been very careful about this. Now, he was misled probably a little bit himself when he asked questions. So the other person to call is Dianne Feinstein. Some people think she's even the most powerful person because she sits as chair of the Intelligence Committee. Up until recently, she was opposed to any reform of NSA. She was actually proposed a bill that would expand the NSA's spine. But in the last couple of days, there's been some signs that she's finally getting it. Unless the public reacts and makes calls to their own elected senators in Congress, and unless I would say this might even be a time, if they've never been in the street before with a sign that says "Stop spying on me," what good is this doing? This is hurting national security. I would say that we might be at this time. Freedom of the press is extremely important. The other thing that should be happening is the media. All of our radio, TV, newspapers should be extremely alarmed when their own reporters are being considered as co-conspirators, when the UK's intelligence operatives went in with hammers to destroy the Guardian's computer. I mean, that's right out of Orwell. And I think that our media really needs to understand now that they have got to start fighting back, as the New York Times and 19 other newspapers did during the Pentagon Papers. This is a time when they have got to fight for the right freedom of the press.
All right, Colleen, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, that was former FBI agent turned whistleblower Colleen Rowley right here on WHDT World News. Stay tuned. We still have the rest of today's headlines. We've got a lot of news from Hollywood and a full report on the weather coming up right here on WHDT.